Marcus had always loved the way mathematics felt like a secret language. Not the kind of secret that made you feel left out, but the kind that, once you learned it, opened up a world so beautiful and so precise that you wondered how anyone could ever look at numbers and feel afraid. He had learned that language early. Long before college. Long before anyone had thought to give him a label or a test score or a scholarship. He had learned it sitting at a kitchen table in Atlanta, Georgia, with his grandmother beside him, her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose, her strong hands folded around a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. She would say, "Marcus, baby, numbers don't lie. People lie. Numbers tell you the truth every single time if you're patient enough to listen." He had been patient. All his life, he had been patient. And so, on a Tuesday morning in September, when Marcus walked into the introductory calculus lecture at Whitmore University wearing his dark hoodie and his worn canvas sneakers, carrying nothing but a spiral notebook and a quiet confidence that most people mistook for indifference, he was not nervous. He was, if anything, simply present. The classroom was the kind that exists on every college campus in America. Long rows of wooden desks arranged in a gentle arc, fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. A chalkboard that stretched the entire length of the front wall, dark green and chalky white, the kind that smells faintly of dust and possibility. Marcus chose a seat near the middle of the room. Not the front, where students sat who needed the professor to notice them. Not the back, where students sat who needed not to be noticed. The middle. Where you could see everything clearly and still feel a little bit of peace. The room filled slowly. Students drifted in with coffee cups and half-eaten granola bars and the slightly dazed expressions of people who were still negotiating with morning. There was the hum of low conversation, the shuffle of backpacks, the sound of chairs scraping against tile. And then Professor Gerald Harmon walked in. He was the kind of man who had been 60 for a long time, even before he turned 60. Silver-haired and sharp-featured, dressed in a dark suit with a silk tie knotted precisely at his throat. He moved with the measured confidence of someone who had stood at the front of this room for more years than most of his students had been alive. His shoes were polished. His expression was pleasant in the way that certain formal occasions are pleasant. Correct and controlled. He set his briefcase on the desk. He uncapped a piece of chalk. He turned to the board without greeting anyone. He began to write. The equations appeared quickly, one after another, filling the board with the kind of notation that makes people who have not spent time with advanced mathematics feel a little breathless. Integrals nested inside integrals. Functions folded over themselves. A long, layered expression that seemed to grow more complex with every passing moment. The room had gone quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a group of people paying attention. The tense, held breath quiet of people who feel slightly out of their depth. Gerald Harmon finished writing. He stepped back. He capped his chalk. He said, without turning around, "This is what the semester will look like. This is where we are going. Most of you will find it difficult." He paused. "Some of you will not make it." There was a ripple through the room. Nervous laughter from one or two students. A girl near the front straightened her spine. Gerald turned then, slowly, and let his gaze travel across the rows of young faces. It stopped when it reached Marcus. Something shifted in the professor's expression. Something too small and too quick for most people to catch. But Marcus had been in rooms like this before. He had learned, long ago, to notice small shifts. Gerald Harmon looked at Marcus the way certain people look at things they have already decided about. He said, "You. Come up here." Marcus blinked once. Then he stood. He moved to the front of the room with the same unhurried ease with which he did most things. He stood beside the professor and looked at the board. The professor gestured at the final expression at the bottom of the board. The one where the red arrow was pointing. The one that was, even among the other complex equations, notably dense. He said, with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, "Solve that." There was a beat of silence. The students in the rows shifted. A few exchanged glances. A boy with dark hair near the window pressed his lips together. A girl with a notebook open on her desk held her pen still and watched. Gerald Harmon was still smiling. It was the smile of a man who had already written the ending. Marcus looked at the equation for a long moment. It was not a simple problem. That was true. It involved a double integral over a non-standard domain with a kernel function that required a substitution most undergraduate students, even strong ones, would not immediately recognize. It was the kind of problem that showed up in graduate-level coursework. The kind that took time. Marcus said, quietly, "May I have the chalk?" Gerald's smile flickered. Then he held out the chalk. Marcus took it. He stood at the board for a moment, and in that moment, the room was so still that you could hear the fluorescent lights. Then he began to write. He did not rush. He never rushed. His grandmother had taught him that too. She had said, "The ones who rush are afraid the answer will get away from them. The ones who are sure take their time." He began with the substitution. He wrote it out in clean, clear notation, each symbol placed deliberately, the work organized in a column that moved down the board in a logical progression that anyone watching could follow. There was a moment, about halfway through, when one of the students in the front row leaned forward slightly. Then another. Then the girl with the notebook lowered her pen and simply watched. Gerald Harmon stood with his arms at his sides. Marcus continued. He reached the point in the problem where the substitution resolved, where the double integral collapsed into something manageable, and he paused there. Not because he was stuck. Because he wanted to make sure the work was clear. Because he had learned, from his grandmother, that doing something right was not enough. You had to do it in a way that other people could understand and follow and carry forward. He wrote the final steps. He set the chalk down on the ledge. He stepped back. The answer was there on the board. Complete and correct, the work shown in full, the logic laid out step by step in a way that could be followed by anyone patient enough to read it. The room was absolutely silent. Gerald Harmon looked at the board for a long time. What happened next was something that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. Not because of what Gerald said, but because of what his face did in the seconds before he said anything. It crumpled. Not dramatically. Not in the way of movies, where things are always larger than life. It crumpled in the small, human way of a person who has just realized something true about himself and does not entirely like what he is seeing. It was the look of a man who had made an assumption without knowing he was making one. And who was now standing in the wreckage of it. Gerald Harmon looked at Marcus. He said, his voice quieter than before, "How long have you been studying mathematics?" Marcus said, "Since I was about 7. Gerald said, "Where?" Marcus said, "At a kitchen table in Atlanta. My grandmother taught me." Gerald looked at him for another moment. Then he looked at the floor. Then he looked back up. He said, "I owe you an apology." The room seemed to hold its breath again. He said, "I made an assumption about you when you walked in. I should not have done that. I am sorry." Marcus nodded once. He said, "I know." And that was all. He walked back to his seat. He sat down. He opened his spiral notebook and uncapped his pen and waited for the lecture to begin. But the lecture did not begin quite yet. Because Gerald Harmon was still standing at the front of the room, and he was looking at the board, at the long careful column of work that Marcus had written there, and something was happening in his expression that none of his students had likely ever seen before. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from too little sleep. The kind that comes from having carried something heavy for a very long time. He said, to the room, to no one in particular, to everyone, "I have been teaching this class for 31 years. He paused. He said, "I have made mistakes in those 31 years. Today, I made one in front of all of you." He turned to face the class fully then. He said, "That matters. How we treat people, how we see people before we know them, that matters more than any equation I could write on this board." He picked up a piece of chalk. He said, "That young man just solved a graduate-level problem correctly and completely, on his feet, with no preparation. That is exceptional." And he did not need my recognition to know it was exceptional. He set the chalk down again. He said, "That is the kind of certainty I hope this semester gives each of you about mathematics. But more than that, I hope it gives you that certainty about yourselves." He was quiet. Then he turned back to the board and the lecture began. That evening, Marcus walked back across campus slowly, the way he usually did when he needed to think. The sky had gone the pale gold and lavender of early autumn, and the trees along the main path were just beginning to turn at the edges, the green giving way to something warmer. He thought about the morning. He thought about the way Gerald Harmon's face had looked when he stepped back from the board. He had seen that look before. Not often. But he knew it. It was the look of someone arriving somewhere they should have been all along. He stopped at a bench near the fountain in the center of campus and sat down. He took out his phone and called his grandmother. She answered on the second ring the way she always did, as though she had been expecting him. He said, "Grandma. I had a good day." She said, "Tell me." And he did. He told her about the classroom and the chalkboard and the long equation at the bottom of the board with the red arrow pointing at it. He told her about standing up and taking the chalk. He told her about the silence in the room and the way he had taken his time, the way she had always taught him to. And he told her about Gerald Harmon. He told her what the professor had said. How his face had looked. What he had told the class. His grandmother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Baby, that man learned something important today." Marcus said, "I think so too." She said, "People can learn. That's the thing most folks forget. People can learn at any age, in any room, on any kind of day. The question is whether they're willing." Marcus looked at the fountain. The water caught the last of the evening light and threw it back in small bright pieces. He said, he was willing. His grandmother said, "Then you did good. For both of you." After he hung up, he sat there a little longer. He thought about the things his grandmother had given him. Not just the mathematics, though that was part of it. The patience. The steadiness. The quiet certainty that he belonged in any room he walked into, not because anyone had told him so, but because he had done the work and he knew the work and the work was real. He thought about how Gerald Harmon had looked at him when he walked in that morning. He had recognized the look. It was not unfamiliar. He had seen it in other rooms, in other doorways, on other faces. It was the look of someone seeing a category instead of a person. He was not angry about it. He had learned, over the years, that anger was a fuel that burned hot and fast and left you empty. What he felt instead was something older and steadier. A kind of sorrow, yes, but also something else. Something that might have been hope. Because Gerald Harmon had not stayed inside that look. He had moved through it to something truer. And that, Marcus thought, was worth something. That was worth quite a lot. The following weeks passed in the way that a good semester passes when you are doing work you love. The classroom became familiar. The other students became faces and then names and then people with their own small histories and their own ways of thinking through a problem. Gerald Harmon was a different kind of teacher than he had appeared to be on that first morning. He was demanding, yes. He was precise and somewhat formal, and he did not soften the material or offer comfort where there was none to be offered. But he was fair. He was thorough. And he had a way of asking questions that pushed students toward insight rather than simply toward answers. Once or twice, Marcus caught him watching. Not the way he had watched on that first morning. Something different. The way a person watches when they are genuinely curious. When they are paying the kind of attention that means they expect to learn something. One afternoon in late October, Gerald asked Marcus to stay after class. The other students filed out. The room settled into its empty afternoon quiet. The chalkboard was covered in the work from the day's lecture, a long exploration of convergence that had taken the full hour. Gerald stood at the front of the room with his hands in his pockets. He said, "I've been looking at your work. Your submitted problem sets." Marcus waited. Gerald said, "You are not where I thought you would be when you walked in here in September." Marcus said, "Where did you think I would be?" Gerald said, "I thought you would be capable. That morning showed me that. But I thought you might be one of those students who peaks early. Who has one good moment and then finds the sustained work more difficult." He paused. He said, "I was wrong again." Marcus said, gently, "That happens sometimes." Gerald looked at him. Something in the older man's expression shifted in the direction of something that might, eventually, become a smile. He said, "I'm going to recommend you for the Advanced Mathematics Seminar in the spring. It's a small group. Graduate students, mostly. But I think you belong there." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He said, "Thank you." Gerald nodded. He said, I also want to say something to you. Directly, and not in front of the class. Marcus waited. Gerald said, what I did on the first day was wrong. I knew it when I did it, in some part of myself that I had learned to ignore. I called you up to that board because I assumed you would fail, and I thought that would prove something to me that I had already decided was true. He stopped. He said, I have been thinking about that since September. About how many times in 31 years I may have done something like that without knowing it. Without being caught. Without being shown, the way you showed me, that I was wrong. The room was very quiet. Gerald said, I don't know how to make that right, entirely. But I wanted you to know that I know it. That I am not going to stop knowing it. Marcus looked at this man who had spent 31 years in this room and who was standing now in a kind of honesty that was clearly not easy for him, and he felt something open in his chest. He said, my grandmother always told me that the people who scare you most in life are the ones who are sure they don't have anything left to learn. Gerald listened. Marcus said, you scared me a little bit, the first morning. But not for long. Gerald said, quietly, what changed? Marcus said, you looked at the board. Gerald thought about that. He said, I suppose I did. Outside the window, the campus had gone gold with October. Students moved along the paths below, their breath faint and white in the cooling air. Somewhere on the other side of the building, someone was laughing. A door opened and closed. Marcus picked up his bag. He said, I'll be here in the spring. Gerald nodded. He said, I know. Marcus walked out of the room and down the long corridor and out into the afternoon, and the air was cool and clean and smelled like fallen leaves and the particular sweetness of a world continuing to turn. He did not think about triumph. He was not that kind of person. He thought about his grandmother. He thought about the kitchen table and the cold cup of coffee and the way the numbers had always felt, from the very beginning, like something solid in a world that was not always solid. He thought about Gerald Harmon standing at the front of the room in his polished shoes and his silk tie, saying, I was wrong again, in the quiet way of a man who was learning, even now, to tell the truth. And he thought that this was the thing about people that his grandmother had always insisted on. The thing she had never let him doubt. Not even in the hardest moments. Not even in the rooms where the looks came fast and certain and cold. People can learn. At any age. In any room. On any kind of day. The question is whether they are willing. He pulled his jacket a little closer against the October air. He thought about the spring. He smiled, and walked on.